Bonjour mes amis et bienvenue sur ma chaîne YouTube. Je m'appelle Georges, comme vous bien savez, et j'adore la littérature française. Aujourd'hui, je voudrais parler d'un grand auteur français qui s'appelle Georges Perec, en particulier de son chef d'œuvre, bien sûr, La vie, mode d'emploi. C'est un roman magnifique, fantastique, très intelligent, exorbitant, et c'est le premier livre que j'ai lu de Georges Perec. Mon ami Ralph a recommandé ce roman et je suis très heureux après la lecture. Donc, merci beaucoup Ralph. Vielen Dank, mein Freund. Alors, parlons de la vie. Let's talk about life. What is life? Believe it or not, life is a novel. And it's not just any novel, it's one of those novels that actually cause you to ask yourself the question, what is a novel? One of the best definitions of the genre that I have encountered in my life as a reader is the one offered by Camilo José Cela, an author that has been very influential in my life and whom I expect to tell you more about in the future. And this is what he said. Camilo José Cela said, "A novel is a book that bears the inscription, a novel, on its cover." Do you like that? I absolutely love that. I think that is one of the most accurate definitions of the novel that I have encountered in my entire life, and it's really a definition that I can live with, to be honest with you. So how does one even begin to talk about a book like Life, a User's Manual by Georges Perec? Let me tell you first about the premise. That's probably the best way that we can start to approach a book like this one. This is the story of a cast of diverse characters who all live in the same apartment block in Paris. We actually get the address, but please do not go to Paris and look for this address because you're not going to find it. It only exists in the realm of literature. So for the moment, just let me say that. So let's look at the book itself, okay? This is a novel that is 500 pages in length. It is divided into 6 parts, and those 6 parts are divided in turn into a total of 99 chapters, though it also includes a preamble and an epilogue. So we're looking roughly at 100 chapters divided into those 500 pages. But then when you finish reading the novel after the epilogue, after chapter 99, you're going to see that you have some other things. For example, you have this drawing of the apartment and the people who live there, and also the people who used to live there. And then you also get an index, a very detailed one, of names of works that are mentioned and things like that. And after that index, you also get a chronology of some of the stories that are related in the novel. After that, you have a list, an alphabetical checklist of some of the stories narrated in this manual, because you're going to see that this is a story that is made up of many, many different stories. So it's really good that we have that guide. And after that, finally, the author includes a postscript that I thought was lovely, in which he gives credit to many of the authors that inspired this work. And let me just read you some of these names so that you know what we are dealing with. We have the name here of Jorge Luis Borges. That rings a bell. Do you think there's going to be a Borges connection in this video? We'll see about that. Italo Calvino, Agatha Christie, Gustave Flaubert, Sigmund Freud, Alfred Jarry, James Joyce, Franz Kafka, Thomas Mann, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Herman Melville, and many others like François Rabelais, Raymond Queneau, Lawrence Stern, and also a guy by the name of Georges Perec, which kind of rings a bell at this moment. So I think this is a wonderful idea. If I ever write a novel, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to include a little page of acknowledgements at the end to sort of connect it to other authors that have inspired me, at least the ones that have done so in a conscious way. So let me tell you a little bit now about the premise and maybe a little bit about the structure so we can continue talking about this. The novel bears an epigraph from Jules Verne that I thought was very appropriate. And it says, "Look with all your eyes, look." And this is from Michel Strogoff, which is quite appropriate. You're probably smiling if you know about this story, because looking is really a central topic here. And after that, after the epigraph, we get the preamble to the novel. And there's an epigraph also there by Paul Klee that says, "The eye follows the paths that have been laid down for it in the work." So it's really about looking. Very appropriate in this novel because this novel actually allows us to look at the lives of these characters who live in this apartment block almost in the way that a voyeur would look at these lives. So the first thing we get after that is a preamble, which I mentioned before, and this is a meditation on puzzles. I thought that was excellent also because the puzzle, I think, is one of the greatest metaphors for life ever. Basically, each one of us is a piece of the puzzle, and we are incomplete in ourselves, if you want to look at it that way. And also, there's this idea included in this that you can only see the big picture once you have put all the pieces together, and also once you take some distance, right? Because if you look at the picture too close, you're not going to be able to see much. You need that sense of distance in order to get that perspective that is central to us approaching anything, really. If you go to page 189, at least in my edition, which is the UK edition, by the way, you're going to find a sentence that I wanted to share with you because I feel that this is pretty much the key to the novel. And here we can read, "You can look at a piece of the puzzle for 3 whole days. You can believe that you know all there is to know about its coloring and shape, and be no further on than when you started. The only thing that counts is the ability to link this piece to other pieces. And in that sense, the art of the jigsaw puzzle has something in common with the art of Go. The pieces are readable, take on a sense only when assembled. In isolation, a puzzle piece means nothing, just an impossible question, an opaque challenge." Just like Rayuela by Julio Cortázar, which I have right here, so I'm going to show you that, and we'll come back to this also. These are two novels that are in direct dialogue, or at least you can put them in dialogue with each other. So just like Rayuela, Life User's Manual includes the clues that you need in order to read it. Because this is a very complex text and just a huge tapestry of stories, what I thought I would do in this video is to follow a kind of an episodic thematic approach. That's what I'm gonna do. So if you're ready, let's explore this thing called life. So Jorge, tell me something about the plot. That's very easy, my friend, because there is no plot. There are no protagonists either, though there are a few central characters that we are going to pause on in a little while. But basically what Life, a User's Manual does is to share with us the stories of all these characters who live in the same apartment complex, but in sort of a random order. Now, because of that, I would say that there is no plot here, but rather what we have is what I like to call dérive. We have this word in Spanish. Unfortunately, in English, there's nothing equivalent to it, or there is, but not exactly a word that looks like it. But in Spanish, we have the term a la deriva. You can say maybe that a boat is a la deriva, and that means that it is adrift. And that's what's happening here in this novel by Georges Perec. The narrative is adrift. So this concept of dérive is one that I found out about many years ago when I was doing some research on the novella, because it's a type of narrative device that you will find in the novella, not so much in novels. For obvious reasons, because for example in novella you have a very brief text most of the time. It can be 100, 150, sometimes maybe 200 pages, and much less than that too. So it's ideal for the novella. To write a novel that follows this structure, or this device of the dérive, really takes guts, because how are you going to keep the reader interested in such a long text, especially when you have something like 500 pages, when the narrative is completely adrift? Well, Perec succeeds, one, because he is a brilliant author, but also because what he's telling us here is not one story, but rather many stories. This is, if you will, a kind of a braid of novellas. That's one way that I would describe it. And that's one of the reasons why we are interested in what Perec is saying. If you have one big, one long novel based on a dérive kind of structure or approach, it's just very difficult to continue with that, because the reader is going to get bored sooner or later. But that doesn't happen in Life, a User's Manual, because we have so many stories and all of them are fascinating. To say something about life, or about people, which in this case amounts to the same, the best thing that you can do, I believe, is to look at one of those places in which lives intersect, where you have many lives coming together at the same time. And speaking of places and spaces, here's one book that I wanted to recommend to you, Gaston Bachelard's The Poetics of Space, that really illuminates a reading of Life a User's Manual and also of many other books, of course. I did a poetic essay on this, or a video essay, that you may want to check out, and I would actually like to know what you think about that. Do you like that approach of the video essay? Because I would like to see if maybe I can do more of those. But definitely check out The Poetics of Space. So what better setting, given that idea, than an apartment complex? When I was reading this novel by Georges Perec, I kept thinking and I kept being reminded of the many years that I spent in an apartment complex back in Buenos Aires when I was a kid and when I was a teenager. And the novel really reminded me about the richness of these places, all of those lives. It's like you can just look at all of these apartments and be fascinated by what goes on inside them, maybe not at the present moment, but also in the past lives of all of these people. That's another thing that we're going to talk about in a minute. So an apartment complex is really a collection of stories in itself that make up a novel. And I'm not talking about just the one in the novel by Georges Perec. I'm talking about any apartment block. It's really an ecosystem. It's a microcosm. It's just a living organism, and the book in itself. So that presents a problem to the author, on the other hand, because how do you tackle the plurality of stories that you can find in an apartment block? You know what I'm saying? It's like so many lives. This, of course, is going to depend on the author. Every author is going to have a different approach to this. But what Perec does is that he employs a kind of an encyclopedic hyper-realism. That's how I would define the type of approach that we have in this novel, at least, by Georges Perec. One thing you're going to find, not only in this one, but this is something that applies to other books by him, you're going to find plenty of lists. Perec is an author who seems to have been in love with lists, and especially we're talking about lists of objects, okay, as in an inventory of life. And one thing that I remembered when I was reading this kind of a list approach was the penultimate chapter of Ulysses, the one that kind of imitates the catechism style. And there is one of the questions in which the narrator ends up giving you basically an inventory of all of the books that you can find in the room that is being described. That is the sort of thing that you will find sometimes in Georges Perec, and especially in Life User's Manual. And let's also keep in mind that Perec wrote a novel titled The Things, in which things are more important than people. And that begs the question, right? Why are things so important? One of the reasons, and I believe one of the answers that Perec would give, is that every object, everything contains one story or many. There's just an explosion of stories when you look at a thing. And I can show you, maybe in a future video, some things that I have here in my house that remind me of things that happened to me and that kind of give rise to this storytelling impulse. For example, in this novel, in chapter 40, right, the narrator tells us about a robe that is hanging from someplace in the room. And this robe basically inspires him to tell us the story of the black boxer. It's just looking at the object, just as you might have in Proust, for example. You look at something, or you taste something, you smell something, and that triggers just an impulse of storytelling that could almost be infinite if you followed it to the very end. So we are really surrounded by things, which is also another way of saying that we are surrounded by stories. Now, that has to do with the hyper-realism of the novel. I also told you about the encyclopedic type of aspect to it. That is very important also. And I would say that Perec is one of those authors who are not afraid of exhibiting their knowledge and their research also, because this knowledge doesn't come from nowhere, right? They did some research. He reminds me of Pynchon. I was thinking of a novel like V, for example. He always reminds me of somebody who learned a lot from Pynchon, who is Roberto Bolaño, the great writer from Chile. So those encyclopedic authors that have that desire to tell us stories and to share their knowledge with us. The fact is that there is always more to us. There is always more to people than meets the eye. Okay, whether we are just aware or not, each one of us has been a part of history through our ancestors, for example. So if you look at it that way, each one of us is basically the tip of the iceberg, literally, because you can just go back to each person, all of their lives, all that happened before them, everything that their ancestors did, and all that. So these are stories that we all have, and that unfortunately, with the passing of time, sometimes they are lost. I cannot go back a lot. If I look at my past, I can only go back so far to some of my ancestors. The previous stories have been lost, right? But think about how many people have that desire to learn more about their past and more about their families through DNA tests or through those websites that allow you to find out about your ancestors. So that is definitely, a very human impulse and a very human desire to learn more about ourselves and where we come from ultimately. So Perec tells us the stories behind each person and everything that he or she may be unaware of too, because we don't know if these characters are aware of all that happened in their past. What we know is what Perec tells us. And I think that is what makes life fascinating. One of the guiding principles of Life a User's Manual is the desire to name everything, the desire to leave nothing out. I mentioned before Joyce, I mentioned Bolaño, but we should also add the name of Virginia Woolf, who once said that one should put everything into the novel. Now, I don't have the source for this because this is something that I read in the introduction to this Spanish edition of Rayuela or Hopscotch by Julio Cortázar. So unfortunately, I cannot tell you the exact source for that quote from Virginia Woolf, but I really like the idea and I think it really applies to Perec, especially in this case the novel that we are talking about. So the concept of a total novel is somewhat related to the approach, the worldview of the Baroque movement, because one of the characteristics of that movement, and that is definitely something that you see here and in so many other books, maybe even in Rayuela, is horror vacui, so basically a horror or a fear of the void. They had this idea that the void should not be there. You should always try to fill out the empty spaces. So just like life itself, Life, a user's manual, contains vast numbers of genres and of themes. There are so many things that you can find here. This is really a multi-genre, I would say polythematic work. For example, in terms of genre, you find history throughout the book, of course, but there's also satire, there's also romance, there are elements of horror at one point or another. The chapter that I remember in this context is chapter 31, in which we get a really good murder mystery and also a story of revenge. So you can see all of those genres are included in this book. And also the themes, of course, the themes are really, really numerous. We have everything. I mean, you name it, it's here. Art, cycling, the hotel industry, medicine, boxing, revenge, travel, so many things. And besides that, besides having so many themes and also so many genres, it is also a global novel because the stories that we hear in this novel take us really to all sorts of places throughout the world. That's another reason why I mentioned Pynchon, especially V. And I was also thinking of a novel like 2666 by Roberto Bolaño. This is a novel that is really all over the place, literally, because through it we can really travel to all sorts of places in all the corners of the world. I said before that even though there are many characters, there are no protagonists, but there are still some central characters in Life a User's Manual. One of them is Bartle Booth, who likes to solve puzzles. And by the way, if that name rings a bell, it is meant to ring a bell, definitely. There's another character by the name of Winkler, who is the one who likes to create puzzles. But of all the central characters that we find, I believe there's one that stands out, and that is the character of Serge Valen, who is the one who has been living in this apartment complex for the longest time. He arrived there, we actually hear about this in 1919, at the age of 19. And there are chapters that are titled On the Stairs. So if you follow those chapters, you're going to hear the story of Serge Valen. So why is Serge Valen so important? Well, he is working on a painting of the building that is the setting of the novel. If you read the back cover description to this edition, which is the UK edition, as I mentioned before, they even emphasize the importance of this Serge Valen character to maybe give a little bit more unity to this plurality of stories. So let me read you that. It says here, Serge Valen wants to make an elaborate painting of the building he has made his home for the last 60 years. As he plans his picture, he contemplates the lives of all the people he has ever known there. Chapter by chapter, the narrative moves around the building, revealing a marvelously diverse cast of characters in a series of ever more unlikely tales, which range from an avenging murderer to an eccentric English millionaire who has devised the ultimate pastime. That is the back cover description here. There's actually a very good passage here that I would like to share with you that is almost, in a nutshell, what the whole novel is. Let me share this with you, and you can judge for it yourself. So this is page 127, and it says, "The very idea of the picture he planned to do and whose laid out, broken up images had begun to haunt every second of his life, furnishing his dreams, squeezing his memories. The very idea of this shattered building laying bare the cracks of its past, the crumbling of its present, this unordered amassing of stories, grandiose and trivial, frivolous and pathetic, gave him the impression of a grotesque mausoleum raised in the memory of companions petrified in terminal postures, as insignificant in their solemnity as they were in their ordinariness, as if he had wanted to both warn off and to delay these slow or quick deaths which seemed to be engulfing the entire building, story by story." And yes, that is one whole sentence, and after that it continues a little bit and names some of the characters. But very important also, if you continue reading close to the midpoint of the novel, this character of Serge Valen decides that he is going to be himself included in the painting of this building. So at that point it's just impossible, at least for me, not to think of Las Meninas by Velázquez, right? This is really a self-reflective text. It is a text that contains itself. It is a text that meditates on the very meaning of what it means to be a novel. That's a great example of Mise en Abyme, and that's why I mention it. I promised you a Borges connection, so here it is. Borges is of course mentioned in the postscript, as I told you before, but within the actual text of the novel there are also allusions to Borges's works, and the most obvious one I would say is the mentioning of Tsui Pen and also of Stephen Albert. Characters, of course, from one of Borges's most famous stories. I am talking about The Garden of Forking Paths from his most famous collection, Ficciones. So I often wonder, like many other people who read Borges, what would a novel by Borges have looked like? I mean, haven't you asked yourself that question? If you're a fan of Borges, it's like one of the ultimate questions. I personally don't think that Life, a User's Manual would have been a novel like one that Borges would have written, but I think that he would have been attracted by this idea of the place where so many stories, so many narratives converge. I'm thinking, for example, about the Aleph, right? The Aleph is a point that explodes, that includes all points. It's this one place where all of these things intersect. That is exactly what Life, a User's Manual is. So I think, at least in that sense, this is a novel that Borges would have enjoyed very much. Perec learned the art of the tangent from Laurence Sterne, among other writers. If you remember Tristram Shandy, that is a frustrated story that both frustrates and delights the reader. But another novel that I was thinking about, and another author to whom Georges Perec gives credit in that postscript, is Melville's Moby Dick. So it is right here. This is another tangential and encyclopedic novel. So that's why I made the connection with Life, a User's Manual, and also because we have that character named Bartle Booth, which is a clear allusion to Bartleby the Scrivener, that great novella by Melville that I encourage you to check out if you haven't read it already. So this idea, the tangent, is directly related to the concept of the dérive that I was sharing with you before. In one chapter, just to give you an example, we hear that there's a kid reading a story. And then there's a break in the text, and right after that, the author proceeds to tell us the story that the kid is reading. You see, there is not necessarily a need to do that. He is not called to tell us the story, but just reading that this kid is reading the story leads him to tell you the story. That is a great example of what I mean by the tangential, if you will, style of Perec. And once again, this is really also connected to Borges, because what we have here is a garden of forking paths. You have all these possibilities. And of course, the author cannot follow all of them, but whenever he gets the chance to do that, he goes on a tangent. And those tangents are just delightful. As I have suggested throughout this video, there are many texts that you can put Life User's Manual to dialogue with, but I wanted to share one book and one movie with you that I think have many things in common with this excellent novel by Georges Perec. One of them is the great novel La Colmena, or The Hive, by Camilo José Cela. This is also an urban novel. It takes place in Madrid, and we get also a cast of characters that is just immense, and we see how their lives intersect sometimes. But once again, just like Life, a User's Manual, the idea here is not to present us with a story, not to present us with plot, but with Derive and with all of these characters that we can read about. And once we have finished reading the text, we get this whole tapestry of what is going on in this urban space. And the other text that I inevitably thought about when I was reading Life, a User's Manual is, of course, Decalogue by Krzysztof Kieślowski, which you can see right here, that I always have in my videos. That is one of the most amazing movies that I have seen in my entire life. And of course, it's not a movie, but 10 of them, because they are based on the 10 Commandments. But here's the thing. All of the characters that we see in that film, Decalogue, or those 10 films, if you will, are characters who live in the same apartment complex. So you can see the connection right there. The apartment complex is really just a wonderful setting. It works very well in the novel. It works very well in the series of movies by Kieślowski. But I don't want to say much about these movies, okay? If you have not had the chance to experience Decalogue, please just stop this video right now and find a way to watch Decalogue, because you are not going to regret it. I would like to thank my friend Ralph for recommending Georges Perec to me. He was so insistent about this author, recommended him to me so many times that I thought, okay, this author must really be amazing, and if he's not, let's just read this guy so that I can tell my friend, look, I've read him, you can stop recommending this author to me. So Ralph recommended many books by Georges Perec. I actually have a list, but I said to myself, Jorge, if you're going to read Perec, just read Perec. Go for the big one. And Life, a User's Manual is definitely the big one. It is considered by many to be Perec's masterpiece, or at least his most important novel. Those two things sometimes are not equivalent, but that's another story. So Life, a User's Manual is a monument to you and to me and to us human beings and to life itself. So it's really one of those novels that you read and you go, yes, just yes. That's all I'm going to say as my bottom line here, other than to obviously recommend this novel to you. So what I'm going to do is, because this is a novel that is made up of many stories, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in the description to this video some of my favorite ones. Because you may be thinking, well, yeah, I mean, I would like to read Perec, but we're talking about 500 pages. You know, for people like me, I am a very slow reader, as I always say. You know, 500 pages is quite a bit. That's quite a bit of time. 10 days, you know, it's time, and these days it's very difficult sometimes to find time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a list of my favorite stories from the novel, so that you can maybe at least read some of those, you know, and then decide whether you want to read the whole thing or not. So I think that is going to be helpful. I hope it is. Do you have any questions, comments, recommendations, recipes? I hope you enjoyed this video. Those were my 2 cents on Life, a User's Manual by Georges Perec. Thank you so much for stopping by. Have a wonderful day. Merci beaucoup. À bientôt.